This book is a practical guide to risk, security, and their management. Management means active, positive attempts to influence. Security and risk management means to conceptualize, analyze, assess, control, record, communicate, monitor, and audit risk and security. Security, as described in Chapter 2, is essentially freedom from negative risks. Risks, as described in Chapter 4, are the potential returns, i.e. the consequences, effects, etc., to a target from an event. Everybody should care about better security and risk management because if done well, we would live in a more secure and less risky world. The concepts and skills here are practical. Anyone can accomplish them. This book can be applied in all domains: business, public administration, public safety, criminology, computing, sports, tourism, agriculture, healthcare, education, intelligence, policing, and international relations. Awareness of risk is healthy because everything we do is literally risky. Socializing, starting a business, starting a family, taking a job, going online, posting on social media, driving a car, traveling, and even eating and drinking are inherently risky. Risk can be both positive and negative. We might start a business in hope that the positive risks, such as the chance of earning a profit, outweigh the negative risks, such as the chance of loss. Awareness of risks should not be paralyzing. Awareness of risks helps better management. Good risk management helps us feel secure. Transparent risk management, that is, clear and obvious risk management, helps our confidence. In other books, you might see security management and risk management treated separately, with all sorts of disciplinary peculiarities. In this book, security and risk management are treated as two sides of the same coin. They should be tackled together. You might have heard frustrations about competing standards on how to define and manage risk or security. Do not be intimidated. These pages will point out what to avoid and how to reconcile the contradictions. This book standardizes the concepts and gives you different tools to choose from. These tools can be applied, for instance, to lower exposure to pandemics and also to terminate their sources, to defend against terrorism, and also to co-opt political spoilers as allies, to make your cyber activities more secure and also make cyber threats less secure. Public sensitivity. The use in books of the terms risk and security grew over the last 5 decades by thousands of %. Why? An authority is something assigned or acknowledged to determine or decide. A responsibility is something which an actor should manage or for which an actor should be answerable. Security is a responsibility of government. We expect our military, police, coast guard, border guards, and health authorities to ensure our security. If they fail, we might choose to elect new leaders, to move elsewhere, or to take on more of the burdens of protecting ourselves. Many people have no choice in their leaders, or where they live, or their capacity to protect themselves. As government takes more responsibility, it takes more authority. This trend is exacerbated by increased sensitivity to risk. As societies develop, they should become more secure. As we control the highest risk today, we can move on to the next highest tomorrow. However, risks are not always tackled rationally from highest to lowest. Some risks are championed by interest groups at the expense of others. Risks might have been assessed incorrectly. Some risks are more pertinent or salient. Distortions in assessment are influenced by distortions in our sensitivities. What we consider risky today might be different tomorrow. Somewhat perversely, the more risks we control, the more sensitive we become to risks in general. This helps to explain gradual transfer of responsibilities from persons to governments. This transfer accelerated with industrialization, globalization, urbanization, conflict, and democratization. For instance, in 1974, Britain's government established a health and safety executive, also legislated further protections of job incumbency, and increased unemployment benefits. In the 1990s, critics referred to developed societies as risk societies for two main reasons. First, risk societies are more sensitive to risk in general, despite declines in most risks. Second, risk societies exaggerate physical risks, such as wild animal attacks, and economic risks, while neglecting environmental risks. Risk societies are intensified by the politics of fear, or the politics of security. That is, some politicians play on popular fears in order to discourage resistance to policies. For instance, the George W. Bush administration, 2001 to 2009, in the US, and the Tony Blair administration, 1997 to 2007, in Britain, used the fear of terrorism to avoid scrutiny of counterterrorism policies. They also used false claims about the regime of Saddam Hussein in Iraq, such as current involvement in terrorism and nuclear proliferation, to undermine opposition to their invasion of Iraq in 2003. Terrorism was certainly underassessed in the 1990s, as the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001 made clear. Terrorism was overassessed many years later, as proven by government reassignment of officials from countering terrorism to countering espionage and organized crime. Insurgency was underassessed until years into the Western occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan. State failure and transnational migration were underassessed until a wave of states started to fail in the 2000s. Financial risks were underassessed until the financial crash of 2008. Pandemic risks were underassessed until the COVID-19 virus emerged in late 2019. Democratic political risks were underassessed until the political violence of 2020. Public expectations for security continue to grow. On the other hand, critics warn against declining personal autonomy as governments take more authority over personal risks. For instance, in 2020, some governments criminalized non-compliance with anti-COVID lockdowns and vaccinations. Critics point out that transfers of authorities are also transfers of choices, liberties, and rights. Such transfers can be counterproductive for security and risk management too. Can governments make better choices about your risk than you can? Does irresponsibility encourage risk-taking? Consider the apparent paradox that Britons get unhealthier as their government invests more in public health care. Despite increased attention to risk and security and some improvements in their management, some risks are clearly still being mismanaged. This helps to explain why more people feel concerned about their own security. Meanwhile, governments worry they cannot afford rising fiscal liabilities for public healthcare, retiree incomes, and unemployment benefits. Some governments are already divesting responsibilities. For instance, most governments urge citizens to prepare for emergencies at home and to consult official advisories before they travel. We have good reason to worry about how others manage our risks. You can help by learning to be a good risk and security manager yourself. Organizational sensitivity. All managers should have some training in risk and security. Managers of finances, projects, operations, information, acquisitions, and personnel routinely manage security or risk. Unfortunately, managers are not necessarily trained in security or risk management. Organizations usually assign corporate-wide responsibilities to finance, legal, information, or project managers, or hire former police and intelligence personnel. However, their skills are not quite generalizable. Financial management has suffered crises of credibility after repeated financial crashes. Project management continues to generate skepticism because of government failures to manage large acquisition projects. Information managers focus on cybersecurity, even though most information losses are non-digital, such as verbal and printed data. Procurers could outsource to contractors, but some betray superficial skills and even ethical or legal violations. For instance, in February 2013, the United States government sued a commercial risk rating agency, that was Standard & Poor's, for defrauding investors by supplying ratings of financial products that were not as independent as claimed. In 2015, the company agreed to pay $1.5 billion to the US government and state governments. By the end of this book, you will be differentiated by generalizable risk and security management skills of application anywhere. Official standardization. Some of the dissatisfaction with security and risk management has prompted more standardization in the hope that the loosely defined ways in which people manage security and risk can be replaced by best practices. Standardization is the process of normalizing definitions and prescriptions for how activities should be performed. Standardization helps interoperability, that is, the capability for two different actors to work together, and accountability, that is, the quality of being answerable for oneself, and ideally replaces inferior practices with superior practices. Over recent decades, more international authorities, national authorities, trade associations, and private corporations have standardized practices for managing risk and security, and for describing their management of security and risk to each other. Employers, contractors, government departments, charities, and even volunteers are required to manage in particular ways. Some requirements can be enforced in civil and even criminal courts. From the late 1980s, governments started to escalate and standardize risk management after embarrassments in delivering services and acquiring items as planned. This was particularly true in defense acquisitions worth billions of dollars per year. For instance, in 1989, the US Defense Systems Management College issued guidance on risk management, and in 1992, the British Ministry of Defense started to issue risk guidelines. At the time, most government guidelines were gleaned from the private sector. In 1995, the Australian and New Zealand governments issued their first binational risk management standard. Most governments have effectively adopted the Australian-New Zealand standard, of which new versions were published in 1999, 2004, and 2009. The latter was agreed with the International Organization for Standardization, or ISO, which published a new version in 2019. It is not necessarily the best standard, but at least users share a common standard. The British, Canadian, and US governments continue to vacillate between ISO and departmental standards, effectively navigating between commonality and decentralization. In a large government, specialized departments can justify different standards. Nevertheless, differences interfere with coordination. Worse, some standards are inferior to others, not just different. This book contains 12 chapters, of which the first is this introduction. The next 7 chapters explain how to conceptualize, analyze, and assess. Security in Chapter 2, capacity in Chapter 3, risk in Chapter 4, hazards, threats, and contributors in Chapter 5, target exposure and vulnerability in Chapter 6, uncertainty and probability in Chapter 7, and events and returns in Chapter 8. The final 4 chapters describe how to develop more secure cultures, structures, and processes. Chapter 9, work out risk tolerability and sensitivity. Chapter 10, strategize and control intolerable risks in Chapter 11, and record, communicate, monitor, and audit security and risk management in Chapter 12. Throughout the text, terms are emboldened where defined and italicized where emphasized or compared. After Chapter 12, you will find a list of abbreviations and an index glossary of definitions for quick reference. Each chapter ends with a chapter summary, questions, exercises, and an end of chapter debate.